Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Jason Bolton, who is an Associate Extension Professor and Food Safety Specialist at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. Jason is something that is not often found at a university, a generalist. While his focus is on food safety, Jason has a lot of experience and expertise in a wide variety of food science. We talk quite a bit about the different kinds of applied sciences in food science, and it feels like we only skim the surface of many of them. I learned a lot in our conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. One quick note before we jump into our conversation. The Maine Science Podcast is taking a break for August 2021. Once we hit September 2021, we will be back with more conversations with Maine scientists. Jason, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. Like me, I know that you're not a native Mainer, but happily claim Maine as your home. So I was wondering, before we dive into the science of what you do, if you could let us know how you got here and then how you got into, I'm assuming science had a role in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from Phoenix, Arizona, or one of the suburbs of Phoenix, Chandler. And I had been vacationing in Maine to visit relatives actually in the Orono area since I was a little kid. And so the University of Maine had kind of a special place for me in my heart, but also in kind of nostalgic, in kind of a nostalgic way. And so as a result of that, when it came to choosing a university, that was part of it. The other part was I was interested in some aspect of some sort of application science. So science where it was really applied to something that wasn't quite as a big a breadth as or broad as like basic biology or chemistry or something like that. And I stumbled onto food science as a result of kind of multiple pieces of information. One was I have an uncle who's recently retired from the University of Maine, and he told me about it. But also I had been researching it on the early days of the internet and learning a little bit more about what you did with a degree in food science and what you could do really with a degree in food science, not only just going into the aspect of food research, but also if you wanted to go into medicine or veterinary sciences or dentistry or anything like that, you take essentially all of the pre-med requisites as part of the educational or the academic program. So I thought it would be a good place to start. So I started looking at different universities, and unfortunately, there are no universities in the state of Arizona that offer an accredited food science program. With as large of a program that Arizona State University has, or Northern Arizona State, or University of Arizona, none of them have approved programs. So then really the next closest location was UC Davis outside of San Francisco. And so I looked at there and that they had a great program and everything. And then I saw the out-of-state tuition for California, and I said I should look somewhere else. And I ended up applying to the University of Maine also, and they had a very reasonable cost for out-of-state students and a fantastic program that had been around for a while, had a lot of history, a lot of really great faculty, and allowed students to get early access to research experiences even as an undergraduate. So that's the long story of how I essentially ended up at the University of Maine.
So before I let you dive into all the cool stuff you do, why food science in general? Is that entirely or partly because it is so applied? Like, what was it that got you that route in the first place?
Yeah, part of it was that. Part of it was I also was interested in the concept of culinary arts, although I had no background in it. I still really don't have a background in it. It's very different than food science, but the Food Network was in its infancy at that period of time. And so I'd watched some of the more exciting cooking shows. It wasn't the Julia Childs of the past. It was more interesting, providing more science. Another person that had come out with some online information, but then a pilot show was Alton Brown, who was actually a trained chef, but has a lot of interest in the concept of food science. So he would take concepts in cooking and in culinary arts and provide a scientific explanation and mentioned food science quite a bit. So that kind of sparked my interest. In addition, knowing that I could get a job, even if I just wanted to go get an undergraduate, I could get a job right away. So that was really helpful. And then the fact that you would take all the courses if I decided I want to go into medicine or anything like that. So really broad reaching type of program with a lot of different potential job opportunities after, or academic opportunities.
So I know that you stuck around for your PhD. Before we get into that, I think, a lot of people hear me say this for a lot of different things. I think food science is not only not very well known by people in general. I think the Maine program in particular is particularly not known. So if you wouldn't mind presuming that everybody is kind of like me and that they have no idea what food science is, could you explain that in a broader sense and then
Sure.
maybe dive down deep into what you've done as your academic aspect of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know what it is. And then the other assumption is that food science is kind of a nutrition-based program. And however, we work very closely with the nutrition faculty. Food science, opposed to focusing on health attributes with food and things like that, we really focus on all the science that goes behind development of new foods or existing foods or anything like that. And really the best way to describe it is actually using the really valuable Wikipedia definition of food science, which is the scientific discipline in which biology, chemistry, physical sciences are all used to study various aspects of food. So a great example is, how do you create a salad dressing where the oil and the vinegar don't separate? Well, there's a ton of food science that goes into that. In fact, there are researchers that spend their entire careers looking at what's called emulsions, where it's that mixing of water type or water-like ingredients and fat-like ingredients. And so food scientists study any aspect of that. It could be aspects in meat science. It could be aspects of seafood, food safety, microbiology, chemistry. There's even areas of sensory analysis, how do people, the psychological aspect, and how do people perceive foods? So that it just kind of goes off in all these different areas of some of the major science silos, but it's all applied towards the media of food.
Would engineering fall into that?
Yeah, that's one I missed. Absolutely. So not only the manufacturing of food, so that the massive amount of engineering that goes into the equipment, but also the massive amount of engineering that goes into understanding how do we have a rapid flow or continuous flow of processing of food. How are things going to flow through pipes? How can they be pumped? How do you get air into food, or how do you get volume into food? Things like that. There's a whole cooking of food. Cooking of food is actually a lot of engineering and a lot of thermodynamics. And it's one of the things that I focus on for the seafood industry.
So I know that you've presented at the festival as part of our, what seems to be always present aspect of beer. So that's one aspect that I know you focused on. You just mentioned the seafood industry. I'm pretty sure you've worked with blueberry folks. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure there's a part of Maine food and agriculture that you haven't worked with. So if you just want to take the baton and let me know what you're doing now or what you've done in the past, and then I'll ask you questions more specifically about those.
Yeah, no, you're correct. I mean, the brewing industry is kind of this ever going research collaboration, and so that's still continuing. I have now my third master's student who's working on a fermentation related project, and so I've had students that are working on very specific microbes that go into a certain style of beer, and they were looking at new methods for analysis of those microbes in addition to characterization of the types of things that these yeast produce as they ferment in beer media. And I had a student that also developed a new methodology for analyzing bacteria that's supposed to be there, not the bacteria that could cause beer to spoil. And so that student has now gone on to accept a lecturer position at the university. And then I have a new student that is working on looking at mixed culture. So where you might have bacteria and yeast working kind of in symbiosis to create really neat flavor profiles. And so he's developing a new method for analysis of those and characterization of those microbes in beer. So beer has been a big thing, and it's been good for funding and stuff like that. But other research, I mean, always ever present is food safety. So we do a lot of projects related to produce safety, related to seafood in some aspects. And sometimes they're not always research projects. Sometimes we apply for grants that are for educational purposes. So we just received, my colleague who's the PI, Dr. Hob Machado, just received a USDA grant for educating folks out there around food safety plans for their farms. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at. We're working on another project with farms, looking at their concept of new rules and their understanding of new rules related to produce safety. So what's grown on a farm and how do we maintain the safety of it? So those are some of the other things that I've been working on. And then outside of research, I work individually with a lot of companies to help them problem solve or develop a new process or product and things like that. And so the seafood world is something that's very, very present in Maine, and therefore I'm kept pretty busy by them.
Are you doing both animal seafood and the vegetation seafood when people ask you?
Yeah, I've done a little work with seaweed, and I've worked with several companies that produce seaweed in various forms. So yeah, absolutely. In addition to obviously lobsters and salmon and things of that nature, a lot of molluscan shellfish.
So I realized I failed to mention that you're actually on the faculty at the Cooperative Extension, and what I can't remember is if you have a joint appointment in UMaine faculty as well. So maybe you could explain a little bit about. You said you've done a bunch of work with the public. I don't think most people think of professors at a university doing that kind of work. And I know it's a special feature of cooperative extension in particular. But you seem to be straddling it quite a bit between the research and also outreach and education.
So my appointment is actually with Cooperative Extension and the Maine Business School. So one of the hats I wear is as the food safety specialist. I work with food companies and educate food companies, and that's the Cooperative Extension realm. And so Cooperative Extension imagine it as another college at the university. So, we have natural sciences, forestry, and agriculture. That's where food science lies. Within that college, there's the engineering college, there's liberal arts and sciences, there's education. So we have all these different colleges that are within the university that have all these academic programs. There's the Maine Business School, which is another college. And so Cooperative Extension is the college basically where they, instead of focusing on the typical 18 to, let's say, 25-year-old students, graduate students and so forth, they work with with the public. Those are their students. So it could be in the form of youth, it could be in the form of people that own companies or farms or work for different nonprofits or for-profits or state government or federal government. And they work to basically educate them in various ways related to not only the research they do, but also research that is done at the University of Maine. They bring that to the public, utilize that to help educate the public and better their lives. And so that's the kind of cooperative extension piece. I work in the area of food safety and food science, so educating a lot of processors and producers of food, appropriate ways to do things. We teach USDA and FDA courses that are required in certain areas. And then in the Maine Business School, I teach classes in innovation. So I'm the area coordinator and I run the innovation program out of the Maine Business School.
How hard is it? I mean, your background, I don't actually remember what your PhD is, but what you have.
Food science.
But didn't you have to focus on one specific area? Like all PhDs do that. How hard is it to bounce around from beer to shellfish to business and innovation applications to teaching about USDA stuff, et cetera, et cetera? Like that is a very wide berth from which that you have to work.
Yeah, it is. It's a very good description. It's turning. I would say it's turning on different parts of your brain, even though it's all housed in kind of the same location. But it's being able to understand it and also look for where things create a nice marriage or relationship of different subjects. But it is difficult. And even if you just focus on the food side, take away the innovation business side, and you focus on the food, it is difficult to be a generalist. To be able to help people with specific regulations related to seafood, and then turn on a different part of your brain and say, okay, now we're working on meat and poultry. So there are certain things that are just stored there because of repetition, and a lot of the times it's just knowing where to look for the information and then how to process the information. So I think that's the key part, and then never being complacent with I know enough. Let's just stop there. So it's constantly educating yourself about something new. Some of the newer things I've had to learn in the last couple of years have even been around beverages. So learning more about not only the typical beverages that are out there, but now all these people are producing craft beverages.
When you say craft beverages, I'm assuming you don't mean alcohol-based. You're talking just across the board.
Some of them alcohol-based, but yeah, non-alcoholic seltzers and lemonades and things like that.
I'm just going to go into the weeds here. Is it difficult to figure out some of the taste aspects and the sensory aspects because that can be so individual to each person? So how do you advise someone how to do things with minimal tweaking, I guess, of their product?
Yeah, no, I mean, sensory science, I don't ever claim to be an expert in that area, but that is difficult area. So, a lot of it is making sure that they are testing it with their particular clientele, so someone who might actually consume it.
You're relatively young in the world of academics, I think, which, people can take from that what they want. But you've been doing this for a while. Do you feel like you're getting a really good sense or expertise in one area or another, and you get that just long enough that you then have to switch into something else?
Yeah, I've been doing this for about 11 years now. And yes and no. I mean, some areas, absolutely. And sometimes it's because maybe a fad has died or it's become less popular. And so that it's switching gears to figure out what's the next interesting thing. And, and a lot of academics have to kind of reinvent themselves. I look at faculty when I was starting on as a student, there were still faculty that were here as a result of the big kind of boom and wanting to support the poultry industry, which has since gone by the wayside in Maine. I mean, Maine used to produce a massive amount of poultry and poultry products. Drive anywhere in the state of Maine, and you're going to see, huge buildings where they would store poultry, live poultry. And so there are faculty that have had to reinvent themselves who were hired specifically to support that industry in the area of research and teaching. And, they've had to reinvent themselves. My uncle's a great example. Who was hired as a poultry scientist and then, retooled and became the director of the Lobster Institute and has completed and researched all kinds of things about lobsters and made some pretty big impact within the state from some of his research and outreach.
Is there any part of the state of Maine that you haven't reached? And I ask that because I know agriculture is significant in large parts of the state. And from my sense is food innovation and products are coming from all over as well. And I'm just wondering if you are seeing that too.
I mean, I think I've been just about everywhere. Every once in a while, someone will say, oh, I live in this town and I can't tell you where that is. I don't know any of the townships. So, when I get into letters and numbers, that usually confuses me. Although I do have a pretty good idea where those are located in the state. I would say, I tend to gravitate a little bit more to Southern Maine only because the concentration of businesses are there. However, you get these little pockets of businesses where I'll go and visit. I tend to not try to travel 3 hours to go visit one company unless I'm there for multiple days or something. But, typically I can go and find pockets and, they could be the mid-coast area, it could be, Belfast or down east or when I go up north, visiting several farms or processors and things like that. So, yeah, I've had the opportunity, very lucky opportunity to visit all places in Maine. And even because of some of the work that I do in Atlantic Canada, elsewhere in the US, or some international, seeing those ties back to Maine has been really exciting too.
Do you have a favorite project or product that you've worked on in the last 11 years that not only struck you as really fascinating from like a science aspect or a food aspect, but then also really struck it big? I'm asking this not having any idea if that's even a reasonable question.
That's a reasonable question. Yeah, I mean, there are organizations that I've really enjoyed working with, and for the most part, the lobster industry in general, I've really enjoyed working with very nice people. I have students now that work in for various companies, and same thing with some of the salmon processing. I have students that work for them. But the lobster industry has been really exciting. Various companies that have sold or are currently in business, and so there's a whole bunch of them that I've worked with across the state. pretty much every large manufacturer of lobster and most even smaller manufacturers of lobster and lobster products. The smoked salmon industry, I've learned a lot, and that's been exciting to work with. And so there's quite a few different processors, the biggest being duck trap. So I've worked a fair amount with them, and we've trained a lot of their folks on some of the FDA requirements. And then, over the last probably 7 or 8 years, I've worked with a company called Good to Go down in southern Maine, and they produce camping food. It's dry camping food, and it's really gourmet. So that's been a great company, and they've really become very popular.
I'm curious, when you were growing up in Arizona, did it ever occur to you that seafood would play such a large part of your professional life?
No.
I kind of thought that might be true. I mean, is there anything that you did back when you were growing up that is a direct link to what you're doing now, science-wise? I mean, I know culturally and climate-wise, it's very different. But that's it. You're pretty far afield from where you started.
Yeah, that's accurate. I would say that, there was an aspect of maturing and kind of reinventing of myself, I think, when I came to Maine, because it is so different. And so it's adapting. I grew up in a place where there are 2 seasons, hot and then less hot. So moving from that and extreme heat, and yes, it does get cool in Arizona, and in some cases cold. You get a little frost in the winter, but other than that, it's just very hot. To Maine, where there are seasons. So even just that adaptation alone, let alone any of the cultural changes that have been really fascinating in Maine. I mean, Maine has so many different iconic cultural things and accents all across the state, which I think is really fascinating for a state that's a good sized state, but it's not Arizona or Texas or anything like that. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And then, yeah, the coast. I mean, I spent a lot of time in San Diego. It's still very different coastal community as West Coast versus East Coast. So, yeah, I can't think of anything. I mean, I always enjoyed the ocean on the West Coast, and when we came to Maine, I always enjoyed being in Maine. So, the trees, every once in a while during the summer, I get a smell that's very specific to pine trees, and it's just, to me, it's Maine.
Do you have any? I remembered one time when I was at the Smith Center, you gave whoever we were hosting a tour of the very small kitchen facility that has since been replaced, I think, with a much more impressive, much more functional one. But there was things with blueberries and kind of different products with blueberries, and I bring that up, number one, because I think Maine and wild blueberries is really just one of these extraordinary cool things that we have that most places don't. But also, I know it's been a long time goal for the blueberry folks to find another product for them, because the shelf life and the fresh doesn't work for very long. So I'm just curious if there's been things since that time. I want to say it was 8 or 9 years ago that you could use as an example, if you can talk about it, that is a good example of different ways that you're working with a large scale industry as opposed to one company.
So with blueberries, your point's exactly. Vast majority of them go to frozen, and then it is difficult to distribute a relatively delicate, fresh product that doesn't have a very long shelf life. So that's something they struggle with. There are things that I think they're improving upon, but yeah, it is figuring out a way to do value added where blueberry is the forefront of flavor and color and things like that. So it doesn't just become an inclusion of something. It truly is kind of the star of it still. And there are some products that are being developed at the university with that effort. In addition, I think blueberries go so well as not only a standalone fruit, but also in other kind of dessert products when they're done right. And blueberry jams and things like that are always fantastic. But I think a product that we worked on a long time ago was a product that won a national competition. That was actually when I was a student, and that was a blueberry frozen yogurt bonbon. And that was one of those things that we tried to make a go of it as a food company, and manufacturing was relatively difficult. Also, I was working on my PhD at the time, and it was kind of difficult to balance trying to do that and the PhD work. But I think those type of products, I think, have the ability to really showcase blueberries as a major ingredient to something um, with a very long shelf life, a frozen product like that. Without, of course, there are quite a few different hurdles that go along with that. But I think those type of products are really interesting. I've worked with some companies that are doing some really interesting things around drying of blueberries in kind of a unique process and stuff like that. But yeah, I hope that some of these new products are going to be coming out soon.
So I'm going to make you talk about you said it was a blueberry bonbon. Maybe you could step us through. I'm not surprised you couldn't do that and your PhD work, just as an aside. You already have more than a full-time job doing your PhD work. How do you get to the point where you say, okay, we've got this product. How do we then manufacture it? Because first you have to get to the product. So was it trial and error? Was it, we need more desserts in the world? Was it like, how did you get first to the bonbon part to decide that?
Well, it was a capstone course for my undergraduate, and actually another faculty member here who's our food microbiologist. We were sitting around the table 16 years ago or something like that, and for the capstone course, we had to develop a new food product and walk it through. Take the product through what it would have to, the process you would have to go through in order to develop a new product for a company or organization. Understand marketing trends, sensory analysis, the product development process, all those things. And we were sitting around the table, and blueberries had just started to really resurface as a really functional food that's good for you and has all kinds of wonderful health benefits and anthocyanins and things like that. So we were looking at those and where could we utilize those. And I told the story how for the longest time my uncle had been buying frozen blueberries from a local producer, and someone gifted him a 10-pound bar of dark chocolate. And I think it was more of a gag joke, but he was determined to utilize it in any way possible. And if you've ever seen a 10-pound bar of chocolate, it's like this thick. So you have to use like a chisel to break off any pieces of it. So anyway, for dessert, very commonly you would get a bowl full of blueberries and a hunk of melted chocolate. And it was a fantastic pairing, this dark chocolate and the blueberries. And so I brought that comment up, and my colleague, Jen Perry, Dr. Perry, said, yogurt is becoming as a functional food very popular. And so we started thinking about combinations of that. And then eventually this kind of bite-sized yogurt, dark chocolate blueberry thing popped out of it. And so looking at those trends, the people wanted a more functional dessert option. When you go to the freezer aisle, it's just now it's very different. Before it was ice cream. You might get the occasional frozen yogurt, but nothing that really had quote unquote health benefits to it. And so that's kind of the process that we started. And then it was a little bit of trial and error to try to get the formulation right. You do one thing and you have to then tweak another thing, and making sure it has a long shelf life. It can survive normal shipping conditions and things like that. But once we got out of that class, we decided to enter with a few other students, enter a national competition. We ended up winning the competition, which is at a very large food science conference. About 25,000 people attend the conference every year. So that was kind of exciting. And then it was reformulating it so that we could manufacture more than 50 at a time. And we gotten to the point where in a 10-hour shift, we were doing about 3,000 units.
Holy cow.
Yeah, there's a lot of bonbons.
I am particularly impressed that this came out of a senior capstone project. Number one, just because it's a really great way to have a final piece to what you're doing in college and bring all of these pieces together. But it also brings me back to what you said, that you were looking for something that was very applied. So you had to do all of these different pieces together. Do you think students nowadays have the same process, and that they might have more success or the same success of bringing something to full product after their senior capstone? I mean, is the same process going on now, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it is. The same classes being offered. And now, which is neat, with the other hat that I wear in the innovation program, I think that gives them even better tools to rapidly develop, whether it be ideas or concepts, and have a more systematic approach to it. Not that it isn't a systematic approach when taught in the class, but these are systems that are directly out of industry, which is really neat. And they've been tested not only in industry, but also in our academic program. So I think even that combination, we actually have a lot of undergraduates that are food science and innovation minors that kind of pair those two things because they are such a complementative type programs.
So the innovation part wasn't there when you were an undergrad, but you're able to do it now?
That was developed, the first classes were taught maybe 2007 or something like that. And then really didn't become a program until around 2009, 2010.
The kitchen facility that I briefly mentioned, can you just talk a little bit about what you do use that, right? I'm not.
Yeah, that's the pilot plant facility.
Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, that's what we have a couple different, we have a brewing pilot facility, and we have the general food processing pilot facility. And the food processing pilot facilities, when we need to do larger non-lab scale experiments related to processing of food, we typically go there where there's a whole slew of different types of processing equipment. In fact, we're doing a project in about a month, and we're going to be producing about 2,000 pounds of blanched frozen produce for a company as a pilot.
So would that be, just as an example, what you were saying, your capstone project, how do you go from 50 to scale up to 3,000? That pilot facility would help you figure that out?
Part of it, yeah, absolutely. And even that, being a pilot facility, it's still very small scale. And so really for that product, for example, we really needed to get to somewhere around 50,000 units in order to get into grocery stores and things like that for this type of product, because of the expense of not only the product itself, but also the amount of labor it takes to produce the product.
So is this what the difference is between what you would see in a grocery store and what you might see in a boutique store? Thank you. Yes. I mean, is it a matter of scale as much as anything else?
Yeah, it's scale, and as you grow, you have to be hyper aware of certain things, from quality, from safety, and safety doesn't tend to change all that much with scale, but depending upon how it's being processed, that can drastically change something, some sort of variable where you have to take that into account.
By safety, you mean the actual everything from bacteria to cleanliness in general to just making sure each part of the process doesn't overlap with each other and do something funky quality wise too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's that constant balance. And so as you change a process, you could drastically change a risk associated with the food, and that could have the consequences of illness, foodborne illness in someone. So there's that constant awareness. And the regulations have changed drastically over the last, let's call it 10 years.
Do you think the pandemic has had an impact on how people look at that process-wise, if only because I don't even know if this is true in the food world, but there's more people not scaling up and trying new things and their own businesses and things like that?
Actually, I think it was more of consumers became a little bit more hyper aware of the issues around supply chain. Like that, where suddenly I think a lot of us, I mean, me personally, I've never been in a situation where you go to a grocery store and there wasn't any food, or very limited types of food, or the fact that that was a time I remember when my son was going through a phase where he only liked certain soups, and those soups were not available, and they didn't come back for quite a while because people had stocked up so much. So I think that made consumers aware that, there's certain benefits, obviously, to having a local food source or locally sourced food within a region. And so I think that has caused a lot of interest in whether it be locally sourced produce, locally sourced meat, things like that, some of those commodity type things. So we are seeing a lot of interest in that. From a food, lots of food companies coming out of this, not necessarily. Some hobbyists kind of looking at things, making hot sauces and barbecue sauces and pickles and things like that, but nothing substantial as a food source.
So what projects are you working on now besides the beer projects with your master's students? What do you have on tap for Maine?
I mean, because my position has changed a fair amount, I haven't been able to focus as much on research. I've been doing a lot of teaching. I taught a lot of classes. There was another grant that I was part of related to the Department of Education, and that was on the innovation side. So we were teaching teachers and administrators in schools around our innovation process, or about our innovation process, and how you apply that towards the K-12 education world. So that took up a fair amount of time. But I've been working with a lot of food companies on very small projects here and there. I do a lot of what are called thermal process validations, where the FDA requires you to have scientific proof that when you cook something, it truly, all of it is cooked. So if you're processing, 100,000 pounds of lobster a day, you have to ensure that every piece is cooked. So I do a lot of thermal process studies for companies. And we have quite a few different research / educational grants. We're partners in, my colleague and I, Dr. Machado, are partners in a grant that was funded with USDA and one of our other New England schools that we work with, food science issuing schools. And that's looking at sanitation and teaching train the trainer for sanitation in a whole bunch of different companies and other universities. So sometimes my research isn't just research, a lot of it's education. And so we get fairly big grants to educate people about food safety.
So where does the circular food system research come in?
I'm loosely involved in that. I am mentioned by name a lot in the marketing, which I appreciate very much. But a lot of that is trying to get more and more students to understand that concept. How do we decrease waste of food, all those things, because it's so important. We're producing local food, okay, that's great. We're producing food in general, that's great, but how much of it is getting thrown away? And so it's even looking at that, I think, which is really valuable. How to reduce food packaging. And food is packaged in so much plastic. And you look at, the fact that you have primary, secondary, even tertiary type packaging, where you have to open up all these things, and then how much can be recycled, what has to be thrown out, where does the food come from, who can process it, who can do it safely. There's all these things. And I work with the regulatory bodies in the state of Maine, but also some of the legislature, to discuss some of the risks around food production and doing things, based on science. So I think that's the key part. And that's what we really focus on with our work with Cooperative Extension, is it's got to be based on science. There has to be data to show that this is safe, not just we've been doing it for 100 years and no one's gotten sick that we're aware of. We're doing this based on science.
So how much do you have to weigh packaging safety so that food stays clean, and versus too much packaging, and you've got all the issues with the plastic and the recycling, and like there's a real balance there, and science isn't gonna, there's no exact answer. You have to have parameters. So how do you figure that out?
Yeah, unfortunately, when it comes to those type of things, especially with our expectations of shelf life of food and things like that as a culture, there aren't a whole lot of other substitutes than plastic. Now we're becoming smarter around plastics. I think with bioplastics, I think that's plant-based plastics, plastics that are science going on behind compostable plastics and things like that. I think that's a renewable source of material that I think we really need to explore further, and how much more science can be done with that. Even if we could reduce, a portion of the plastic going into that bag with something that's renewable would be great, or that breaks down, doesn't, last for 50,000 years or something like that. Even what Maine's doing with plastic bags in grocery stores, I think that's fantastic. I know it's an adjustment, and there are still uses for those plastic bags, but let's strategically use those. Or the styrofoam containers. It was kind of an anomaly to me that we were still using styrofoam when we know the environmental detriments of that and implications of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. My daughter is, she's actually at college this summer because the pandemic has, and she said something to one of her classmates like, "Oh, I'm just so glad I never have to see the styrofoam in Maine." And they were floored. They just were like, "What? You guys get rid of it?" I mean, it's very interesting, right? That I think in many ways, Maine is ahead of the game in thinking about how to reduce our impact. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're more connected both to the land and the water. We see much more immediately what happens if we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's a kind of a protection of the kind of sacredness of those things in Maine for a lot of people. And especially when you talk about the relationship and hopefully the growing awareness of tribal lands and things like that. I think that's also something that plays a fact in this, which I think is fantastic, that greater awareness of all of those things in the history besides just, the last 200 years, but what about before that? So yeah, and we're a vacation state, so we want to keep it a nice place that people want to visit and kind of treasure. I love going to meetings and people mention something like, oh, have you ever been to Acadia National Park? Places like that, or when they mention, the new national monument up north at Katahdin and stuff like that. I think those are exciting to hear that people have heard of that or are excited to come visit.
Well, Jason, I'm going to hold in my back pocket the idea of plastic compostability and food safety. So the next time we talk, I can find out what you're thinking about that, because I think it's a really interesting way to go. This has been really enjoyable for me. I hope you've had a good time.
Absolutely.
I love hearing about your work. I don't actually know how you're able to keep track of all the many different, saying that you're a generalist, I think does not at all do justice to all the different things that you're juggling. I think it's really interesting and really great. And I'm glad that you're able to do all those different things, because I think it's pretty important.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for the offer to be on the show and to participate.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast has received support from the Maine Technology Institute and is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is produced and edited by me, Kate Dickerson. I received production support from Miranda Bouchard and social media support from Next Media. The Discover Maine theme is composed and performed by Nick Parker.